Your son is unconscious on the street. The words left her mouth before she had fully formed the thought, a raw and urgent truth spoken into the expensive silence of a smartphone. Lena stood in the narrow throat of an alley, the city's neon glow a distant, hazy watercolor against a sky thick with impending rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and thrown-out food. At her feet, a young man lay on the broken pavement, his face pale under the single, flickering security light. He was beautiful, in the way of expensive clothes and a life lived without friction until now. His dark hair was matted with something wet. His breathing was a shallow, worrying rhythm. She hadn't meant to find him. She had just been cutting through, a shortcut home after a 14-hour shift that had left her bones feeling hollow. Then, a shape in the darkness. A discarded coat?
No.
A person. For a moment, she'd considered walking on. This city taught you to mind your own business. But his hand was upturned, palm open to the dirty sky, and it looked too much like a question she couldn't ignore. His wallet was gone, but his phone was still in his jacket pocket, a sleek, heavy rectangle of glass and metal. The lock screen was a photo of him with an older man, both of them in sharp suits, unsmiling. She'd found the contact under father. There was no other option. Now, the silence on the other end of the line was heavier than the alley's darkness. It was a weighted, assessing silence. It was not the sound of panic. It was the sound of control. Hello, and welcome. If you're here with us tonight, from your apartment in Seoul, or your dorm room in Chicago, or a quiet house in Nairobi, let us know where you're listening from. We tell stories here. And this one starts in the cold, with a choice. A woman, a phone, and a man on the other end of the line who could end her world or save this boy's. The voice that finally came back was low, perfectly level, and coated in ice. Where? Lena gave him the intersection. She described the alley, the dumpster, the faded mural of a bird on the brick wall beside them. She spoke in short, clear sentences, the way she did when a customer was angry, stripping her voice of emotion to give the facts more room. The man on the other end, the father, did not ask if his son was okay. He did not ask what had happened. He asked for her name. Lena, she said. My name is Lena, he absorbed this. She could hear the faint, clean sound of an office in the background. Not a home. Do not move, Lena, the voice commanded. It was not a request. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch him again.
Help is on its way.
Is that understood? She understood. She understood that the boy on the ground was not just any boy and the man on the phone was not just any father. The air in the alley grew colder. The call ended without a goodbye. She stood over the unconscious young man, his stillness a profound disturbance in the city's constant motion. The phone in her hand felt like a borrowed piece of a world she had only ever served coffee to. She could feel the vibration of an approaching engine through the soles of her worn-out sneakers long before she saw the headlights. Two black sedans, silent as sharks, slid to a halt at the mouth of the alley, blocking it completely. The doors opened in perfect unison. 4 men emerged. They were not paramedics. They were not police. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that seemed to absorb the dim light. They moved with a shared, unnerving economy of motion, their steps making no sound on the pavement. One of them, older than the others with a severe face, approached her. He did not look at the boy on the ground. He looked only at her. His eyes were flat, assessing. He held out his hand, not to shake hers, but for the phone. She placed it in his palm. He slid it into his pocket without a word. The other 3 men were already with the boy. They moved with a practiced, gentle efficiency that was more terrifying than any violence. One checked his pulse, his neck. Another produced a small, powerful flashlight, shining it into the boy's pupils. The third simply stood guard, his gaze sweeping the rooftops, the street, the darkness. They communicated with brief, almost imperceptible gestures. A nod, a tilt of the head. The man in front of Lena still hadn't spoken. He was studying her face, her clothes, her posture. He was cataloging her. She's a waitress. Worn shoes. Frayed cuffs. Not a threat, but a variable. He finally spoke, his voice as devoid of warmth as his employer's. You will be compensated for your time. He produced a thin leather billfold and extracted a business card, holding it out between 2 fingers. It was thick, Heavy stock, the letters embossed in a severe, clean font. A name, Park. A single phone number. No address. No title. Wait for a call, he said. It was an order. Then he turned and walked back to the men, who were now carefully lifting the unconscious son onto a compact, foldable stretcher she hadn't even seen them produce. They secured him, covered him with a dark wool blanket, and carried him to one of the sedans. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. The doors closed with a solid, expensive thud. The sedans pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the city's bloodstream. And Lena was alone again in the alley. The only evidence that anything had happened was the faint indentation in the grime where a body had lain and the heavy, important card in her hand. The rain finally began to fall, cold and thin, washing the street clean. Lena walked the 12 blocks to her apartment, the business card a strange, solid weight in her coat pocket. Her building was old, the lobby smelling perpetually of damp carpet and bleach. Her apartment was a single room on the 4th floor, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was clean, meticulously ordered, but it was a room that held its breath, waiting for a life to begin. She made tea, the ritual a small anchor in the night's strangeness. She sat at her small kitchen table, the warmth of the mug a comfort against her cold hands. The card lay on the table in front of her.
Park.
Just the one name. She thought about the voice on the phone, the controlled calm, the immediate assumption of authority. She thought about the men in the alley, their silence, their precision. This was not just money. This was power. The kind of power that moved through the city in unseen channels, shaping events from the shadows. She had stumbled into one of those channels. For a moment, she considered throwing the card away, forgetting the whole thing. It was the sensible thing to do. This was not her world. These were not her problems. But she couldn't shake the image of the boy's upturned hand, the vulnerability in it. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But in a world like theirs, the right thing could be a dangerous thing. She slept for a few hours, a shallow, dreamless sleep, and woke to the gray light of morning. She went to her job at the diner, pouring coffee, taking orders, smiling at customers. The day was aggressively normal. The clatter of plates, the sizzle of the grill, the low hum of conversation. It felt like a film layered over the reality of the night before. No one called. The day passed. Then another. The business card sat on her counter, a silent, demanding presence. She started to believe that was the end of it. She was a loose end they had decided not to tie up. She was nobody. It was a relief. And then, on the 3rd night, there was a knock on her door. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, polite tapping. Lena froze. No one ever knocked on her door. Friends called from the lobby. Packages were left downstairs. She looked through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway. He was young, dressed in another one of those perfect dark suits. He was holding a small, elegant paper bag. He was not looking at the door, but down the hall, patient. She opened the door a crack, the chain still on. "Can I help you?" The man turned. His face was pleasant, his smile practiced. "Miss Lena? My name is Mr. Kim. Mr. Park sent me." He held up the paper bag. "He was concerned you might not have eaten. And he has requested a moment of your time. If you are available, it wasn't a question." The politeness was a veneer over the same unyielding authority she had heard on the phone. She looked past him down the empty, poorly lit hall. There was no one else there, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not being given a choice. "I'll get my coat," she said. The car was another black sedan, identical to the ones from the alley. The interior was silent and smelled of clean leather. Mr. Kim did not speak during the drive, his focus entirely on the road. Lena looked out the window as her part of the city, with its laundromats and corner stores, gave way to another. The buildings grew taller, the lights brighter. They pulled into a private underground garage beneath a gleaming residential tower that pierced the clouds. An elevator took them directly up, opening not into a hallway, but into a sprawling apartment that seemed to float above the city. The entire east wall was a single pane of glass, the city lights a carpet of scattered jewels below. The space was vast, minimalist, and cold. White walls, dark wood floors, furniture that looked more like sculpture than something a person would sit on. And standing by the window, his back to her, was a man in a dark gray suit. He was not tall, but He had a presence that consumed the room's oxygen. He turned slowly. It was the man from the photo on the phone's lock screen. Mr. Park. His face was a mask of aristocratic composure, his eyes dark and intelligent. There were lines of grief and exhaustion etched around them that his control couldn't quite erase. This was the patriarch, the man who made decisions like a man writing contracts. "Miss Lena," he said. His voice was the same one from the phone call. Quiet, level, impossibly calm. "Thank you for coming. Please," he gestured to a pair of low chairs. She sat. He remained standing, a predator more comfortable on his feet. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt physical. "You are calm," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. "On the phone. In the alley. My people noted it. They said you were not afraid." "I was afraid," Lena corrected him, her voice even. "I just didn't see how it would help." A flicker of something, surprise? Respect, passed through his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. He nodded slowly. "My son's name is Minjun. He will recover. He was fortunate you were there." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The official report will say it was a robbery." It was not. It was a message sent by someone who believed him to be alone. He moved from the window and sat in the chair opposite her, a subtle shift in the room's power dynamic. He was no longer observing her from a distance. He was engaging. "The doctors have done their part. Now he needs to heal. But our home is not safe. There is a traitor in my organization. Someone close. Someone who knew where Minjun would be." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You are the only person involved in that night who is clean. You are an outsider. No one knows who you are. You have no allegiances, no history with us. You are, for my purposes, invisible." Lena felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She knew what was coming. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady. Mr. Park's expression didn't change, but his voice softened, a calculated shift. "I want to hire you." "Hire me to do what?" Lena asked. The question hung in the sterile air between them. Mr. Park didn't answer immediately. He steepled his fingers, a gesture of thoughtful precision. He was choosing his words not for clarity, but for effect. "My son is weak. He is recovering in a private wing of this residence. He is surrounded by my people, by nurses, by family. And one of them is the reason he was in that alley." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the patriarch. She saw the father, a deep, controlled grief that lived behind his eyes. "They all have a role to play. They all have a history. They will see what they expect to see. They will perform their loyalty for me. But you see things as they are. You're a waitress. You spend your days observing people. You know when a smile is real and when it is not. You understand the difference between service and servitude. Am I wrong?" Lena didn't answer. He was not wrong. Her survival depended on her ability to read a room, to anticipate a customer's mood, to know who was trouble before they even spoke. It was a skill honed by years of invisibility, of being the person no one really looks at. "I am asking you to be present," Mr. Park continued. "To sit with my son, to bring him water, to read to him, if he wishes, to be a stranger in the room, and to watch. Watch everyone who comes near him. Listen to what they say and what they do not say. You will report only to me." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wanted to use her anonymity as a weapon. He wanted to place her, a poor waitress from the other side of town, into the heart of his dangerous world as his eyes and ears. "I'm not a bodyguard," she said, the words plain and honest. "I'm not a spy. I have bodyguards," he replied, a hint of impatience in his tone. "I have spies. I need something else. I need a pair of honest eyes. I will pay you enough to change your life. You will live here. You will be safe. All I ask for is your perception." He named a figure that made the air leave her lungs. It was a number that didn't feel real. It was enough to solve every problem she had, and a dozen she hadn't even thought of yet. But it came at a cost she couldn't calculate. This was a cage, however gilded. A dangerous game where she didn't know the rules or the players. She looked around the vast, empty room. It was the loneliest place she had ever been. She thought of her tiny apartment, her view of a brick wall. This was a different kind of prison. "I can say no." The thought was there, a small, flickering flame. She could stand up, thank him for his time, and asked to be taken home. But then she thought of the alley again. The cold, the boy's face, the feeling that she had been placed there for a reason. Her life was a series of dead ends. This, for all its danger, was a door. Okay, she said. The word was small, but it landed in the room with the weight of a signed contract. Mr. Park nodded once, the transaction complete. The father's grief receded, and the patriarch was back in control. Mr. Kim will show you to your room. We will begin tomorrow. The room she was given was larger than her entire apartment. It was as impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, decorated in shades of gray and cream, with a bed that looked like it had never been slept in. A closet held a rack of new clothes in her size, simple, elegant, and anonymous. They had anticipated her acceptance. The thought was chilling. The next morning, she was led to the west wing of the residence. The atmosphere here was different.
Softer.
Quieter. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon. A nurse with a kind but guarded face, a woman named Mrs. Cho, gave Lena a brief, professional nod. She was then escorted into a large, sunlit room. And there, sitting up in a medical bed, was the boy from the alley.
Minhyun.
He was awake. His head was bandaged, and one side of his face was a tapestry of purple and blue bruises, but his eyes were clear. They were his father's eyes, dark and perceptive. He watched her approach with a wary, resentful stillness. He was the reluctant inheritor, trapped in a gilded cage of his father's making. Lena felt a sudden, sharp pang of sympathy. "Hello," she said softly. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Minjun didn't respond. He just watched her. His armor was already in place. She was another one of his father's employees, another cog in the machine that ran his life. "My father thinks you can help," he said finally, his voice raspy. "He's wrong. I'm just here to keep you company," Lena said, pulling a chair to a respectful distance from the bed. "If you want me to, I don't," he said flatly. The silence that followed was thick with his hostility. Lena didn't push. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. She was good at waiting. An hour later, a man entered the room. He was older, in his 50s, with a warm, easy smile and impeccably styled silver hair. He carried a small bouquet of flowers. "Minjuna," he said, his voice full of practiced warmth. "Look at you. You gave us all such a scare." He placed the flowers on the bedside table and turned his smile on Lena. It was a politician's smile, wide and meaningless. "And you must be the angel who found him. I am Choi, a friend of the family." This was the antagonist, the trusted betrayer. He performed warmth the way a stage actor performs a monologue. He fussed over Minjun's pillows, his voice a smooth, cloying river of concern. But Lena watched his eyes. They never quite settled on Minjun. They darted around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the security on the door, her own presence. He was assessing the new landscape. He stayed for 10 minutes, filling the silence with empty pleasantries. As he left, he paused at the door and looked back at Lena. "Thank you again for your kindness," he said. "The Park family. They do not forget such things." It was meant to sound like a promise. Lena heard it as a threat. When he was gone, the room felt cleaner. Minjun let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Lena, a flicker of something new in his gaze. "He's been my father's right hand for 20 years, he said, his voice low. "He calls me his nephew." He looked at the flowers on his nightstand as if they were poisonous. "I hate flowers." Days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Lena spent most of her time in Minjun's room, a silent presence in the corner. She brought him meals, which he rarely touched. She refilled his water glass. She read, sometimes for hours, from a book of poetry she'd found in the penthouse library. At first, he ignored her completely, staring out the window at the distant, indifferent sky. But slowly, imperceptibly, the hostility in the room began to recede. He started to listen. He would close his eyes as she read, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. He never commented on the poems, but she noticed he was most still during the ones about the sea. He began to talk, not in conversations but in fragments. Small, disconnected observations about the nurses, the food, the suffocating quiet of the apartment. He was testing the waters, seeing how she would react. She never judged. She just listened. Her role was simple: to be a container for the things he couldn't say to anyone else. She was the stranger, the outsider. Her lack of history with his family made her safe. One afternoon, as she was reading, he interrupted her. "My mother loved that one." Lena stopped, marking her place with her finger. "She passed away when I was 12, he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. She was the one who. She was different. She didn't belong in this world either. It was the first time he had ever offered a piece of himself. A small, carefully chosen piece of his armor, set aside. She used to say this house has no memory," he continued, looking around the room. "Everything is too clean. Too perfect. You can't be sad in a place like this. There's nowhere for the feelings to stick." Lena looked at the pristine white walls, the polished floor. He was right. It was a beautiful, sterile prison designed to keep the messiness of life out. "What was she like?" Lena asked softly. Minjun was quiet for a long time. "She liked the rain," he said finally. "And she made kimchi that was too spicy for my father." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was the first one Lena had ever seen. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it changed his entire face. It was in that moment that she stopped seeing him as the son of a mafia boss and saw him only as a boy grieving his mother in a house with no memory. Mr. Choi continued his daily visits, each one a masterclass in false sincerity. He brought gifts, expensive teas, rare fruits, books on art. He would ask Minjun about his recovery, his voice dripping with concern, but his eyes were always moving, always calculating. Lena watched him. She noticed how he never sat down, preferring to stand, to dominate the space. She noticed how he would subtly position himself between Minjun and the door. She noticed how his questions were never just questions. They were probes, attempts to gauge how much Minjun remembered from that night. One day, he brought a complex chess set, its pieces carved from ivory and obsidian. "To keep your mind sharp," he said, setting it up on a table.
Minun said it.
After Choi left, Lena started to put the set away. "Leave it," Minjun said. "Let's play." He was a brilliant player. Aggressive, intuitive, but with a flaw. He always sacrificed his pawns too early, too easily. He didn't value them. He saw them as disposable, there only to clear a path for the more powerful pieces. It was, Lena thought, how he had been taught to see the world, and perhaps how he had been taught to see people like her. They played chess every day. It became their language, a way to communicate without words. Lena was a defensive player, patient, methodical. She protected her pieces. She built fortifications. She won as often as she lost. During one game, Minjun made a careless move, leaving his king exposed. Lena saw the opening immediately. Instead of taking the win, she moved her bishop to a non-threatening square. Minjun looked up from the board, his brow furrowed. "That was a mistake," he said. "You could have checked me." "I know," Lena replied, not looking at him. "It's your move." He studied her face, then the board. He understood. She wasn't his opponent. She was on his side. He moved his king to safety. A small act of trust, played out on a field of black and white squares. That evening, as she was about to leave for the night, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't just in the alley." Lena stopped at the door, her back to him. "I was meeting someone," he said. "Someone I wasn't supposed to." He was talking to the back of her head, unable to meet her eyes. The confession was too heavy. "I've been looking for something about my mother, how she died. My father said it was an illness, but it never felt right. It was too fast, too quiet." He took a ragged breath. "I found someone, an old driver who used to work for my father. He said he had information. He told me to meet him." In that alley, Lena turned around slowly. Minjun was looking at his hands.
"He never showed up," he said.
"Instead, two men did. I didn't see their faces. They didn't say anything. They just started." A piece clicked into place in Lena's mind. The attack wasn't a message to his father. It was a warning to him to stop digging. "Did anyone else know you were going to be there?" she asked. He shook his head.
"No one."
"I used a burner phone. The driver is an old man. He's terrified of my father. He wouldn't have told anyone, but someone knew," Lena said. "Someone sent those men." She thought back through the last week. The visitors, the conversations, and she remembered something, a detail she had dismissed as nothing. Mr. Choi 2 days ago, talking about the old days. He had been reminiscing, telling a story about Mr. Park's early years. And he had mentioned a name. An old, loyal driver who had retired years ago. He had laughed about the man's superstitious fear of everything. He had named him. He had placed him in the conversation as a piece of harmless nostalgia. But it wasn't harmless. He was testing the waters, seeing if the name meant anything to Minjun. He was checking to see if his tracks were covered. And in that moment, Lena saw it all. The feigned warmth, the constant presence, the carefully placed questions. Mr. Choi wasn't just a traitor to the father. He was the one who had tried to kill the son. The weight of the knowledge was immense. For 2 days, Lena carried it like a physical burden. She had no proof. Only a young man's fragmented memory and her own intuition. To go to Mr. Park with such a thing was a monumental risk. Mr. Choi was his most trusted advisor, a man who had been by his side for decades. She was a stranger, a waitress, an employee of a few weeks. It was her word against his. If she was wrong, she would be dismissed, her life potentially in danger. If she was right, she would be setting in motion a sequence of events she could not begin to imagine. She watched Mr. Choi during his next visit, searching for a crack in his performance. But he was flawless. His concern for Minjun was a perfect imitation of the real thing. He even won their game of chess, a gentle, paternal checkmate. "You must protect your king," he said to Minjun with a warm smile. The threat was hidden in plain sight. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her room, looking down at the city lights. This was Mr. Park's world. A world of power, of loyalty, and of swift, silent retribution. To act, she had to enter that world. To do nothing was to leave Minjun in the hands of the man who had tried to murder him. She thought of her own life. The diner. The long hours. The quiet anonymity. She could go back to it. She could tell Mr. Park she was no longer comfortable in her role and ask to leave. It would be the safe choice. But then she thought of Minjun's face when he talked about his mother. The ghost of a smile. The raw need to know the truth. He had trusted her. He had handed her a piece of his story, and now it was her turn to protect it. She had to protect her king. The next morning, she asked to see Mr. Park. She was led back to the vast, empty living room. He was standing by the window again, just as he had been the first time she saw him. He turned, his face impassive. "You have something to report." It was a statement, not a question. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice level. "Yes," she took a breath. "It's about Mr. Choi." Mr. Park's expression did not change, but a stillness descended on the room, so profound it felt like the pressure before a storm. He did not invite her to sit. He waited. Lena told him everything. She told him about Minjun's search for the truth about his mother. She told him about the planned meeting with the driver in the alley. She told him how Mr. Choi had mentioned the driver's name in casual conversation. She laid out the facts as she saw them, without emotion, without accusation. She presented her perception as evidence. She described the way Choi watched Minjun, the way his warmth never reached his eyes, the way he played chess. She ended with Choi's words from the day before. He told Minjun, "You must protect your king." When she finished, the silence was absolute. Mr. Park stared at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He was weighing her words, assessing her credibility, running 1,000 calculations she couldn't see. She had laid her piece on the board. Now it was his move. He walked slowly toward her until he was standing just a few feet away. He looked not at her, but through her, his mind working. "You understand what you are alleging," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes," she said. "And you have no proof." "No," she admitted. "Only what I've seen. And what your son told me." He was silent for a full minute. Lena didn't dare to breathe. She had done all she could. He turned away from her and walked back to the window, looking down at the city he ruled. "Leave us," he said, not to her, but to the room itself. Mr. Kim, who had been standing silently by the door the entire time, bowed slightly and left, closing the door behind him. Now they were truly alone. "Thank you, Lena," Mr. Park said to the glass. "You have done your job. You may return to your room," and just like that, she was dismissed. Lena spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended animation. She stayed in her room, waiting. She didn't know if she was waiting for a reward, a dismissal, or something far worse. The quiet of the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. Every sound in the hallway made her flinch. She had accused the king's most trusted advisor. There were only two possible outcomes, and both of them terrified her. Late the next afternoon, Mr. Kim knocked on her door. His face was grim, his usual pleasantries gone. "Mr. Park will see you now," he said. He led her not to the living room, but to Mr. Park's private study. It was a room paneled in dark wood, lined with books that looked like they had actually been read. Mr. Park was sitting behind a large, clean desk. He looked older than he had the day before. The lines of grief around his eyes were deeper. Mr. Choi was not there. He would never be there again. "What you suspected was correct," Mr. Park said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond fatigue.
Choi was
compromised. He was stealing from me for years. He believed Min Jun's investigation into his mother's death would eventually lead to him. The attack in the alley was a desperate act of self-preservation. He didn't elaborate on how he had confirmed this, or what had become of Mr. Choi. He didn't have to. The finality was in his tone. The problem had been solved, written out of the ledger in red ink. "You have done this family a great service," he said, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "More than the sum we agreed upon. It is enough for you to start a new life. Anywhere you wish." Lena looked at the envelope. It represented an end to all her worries. A clean slate. A future she could never have dreamed of. She pushed it back across the desk. "That's not necessary," she said. "Our original agreement is more than enough." Mr. Park looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not an employee, not a tool, but a woman of quiet, unshakable integrity. A pawn who had crossed the entire board. "Why?" he asked, the question genuine. "Because you hired me to watch," she said simply. Not to be a part of it. A long silence passed between them. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound, weary respect. "My son has asked to see you," he said, changing the subject. She found Min Jun not in his medical bed, but sitting in a chair by the window, dressed in his own clothes. He was still bruised, still recovering, but he looked different. Lighter. The armor was gone. "My father told me," he said as she entered. "Everything." He turned from the window to face her. "He also told me the truth about my mother. Choi was responsible. It was poison, made to look like a heart attack. He did it because she found out he was stealing." The words were delivered with a calm that was more heartbreaking than tears. He had his truth, and it was devastating. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything that had passed between them. The alley. The chess games. The shared silence. "For what it's worth," he added, a small, sad smile on his face, "you would have been a terrible pawn. You're a queen." Lena stayed for another week, until Min Jun was stronger. They didn't talk about what had happened. They talked about books and the sea, and kimchi that was too spicy. Their friendship was a strange, quiet thing, forged in crisis and defined by all the things they would never need to say. On her last day, Mr. Park met her at the elevator. He handed her the original envelope and a small, velvet box. "For your perception," he said. Inside was a single, perfect pearl on a delicate chain. It was a quiet, elegant piece, something a queen would wear. As the elevator doors closed, she saw him not as a mafia boss, but as a father, standing alone in his vast, empty kingdom. She never saw them again. She took the money and moved to a small town on the coast. She bought a small house with a view of the water and opened a bookstore. Her life was quiet. It was normal. But she was not the same woman who had taken a shortcut through an alley. She had walked through a dangerous world and emerged not just unscathed, but more herself. Sometimes, on nights when the rain was falling, she would stand at her window, look out at the dark, churning sea, and think of a boy in a house with no memory and a game of chess that had changed everything.